Dust Off. By J.C. Menapace. December 4, 2018. Like an eagle soaring overhead, the sight of the green-bellied helicopter approaching from the aircraft carrier USS Intrepid caused a wrenching peristalsis in the pit of Airman Walter Lansford's stomach. It reminded Lansford of his recent escape from a North Vietnamese internment camp for American prisoners of war that he'd escaped by climbing a mountain that seemingly reached into the clouds. Armed with a service revolver stolen back at the prison camp, he watched heartbroken as the crew from the U.S. Navy's rescue helicopter missed spotting him. Posted on his haunches, he waited for the helicopter to make another pass to dust him off to safety. Meanwhile, he imagined the bloody Khmer Rouge staring at the architectural beauty of ancient Angkor Wat and the contrast it created in relation to piles of sun-bleached human skulls piled there by them. He'd been a bombardier flying a mission in Cambodia when a Russian-made SAM, surface-to-air missile, fired by the Khmer Rouge brought it down. They'd captured him and then turned him over to the North Vietnamese. Except for an English-language version of Mao's Little Red Book given to him by his North Vietnamese political education officer, he hadn't had anything else in English to read. For example, the outdated communist newspapers written in Vietnamese and dropped on the stoop of his hooch. He'd feigned an interest in the garbage in them, unadulterated party-line propaganda presented either as art or as political theory requiring no amplification even for the dimwit governed by the so-called enlightened elite dictating it from their zenith of power. Better learn to read the scrap, he'd told himself back then, as a guarantee of receiving the single cup of rice rationed weekly to feed prisoners living under conditions unfit even for pigs. Wah, a political prisoner from along the Cambodian border, never asked any questions of him. Whenever the monsoon rains had threshed the jungle, she'd come to him and pressed her cheek against his chest, telling him of how she'd been forced to watch as her mother, father, sister, and 3 brothers had been beheaded on account of her black marketeering activities. Lansford pictured himself brushing back Wah's glossy black hair from over her forehead. Their captors had put him and Wah to work cooking meals for Colonel Ben, commandant of the prison camp. Lansford knew she had access to the drawer in his desk where Colonel Ben kept a service revolver. He gripped that same revolver's handle tightly now. The only thing that seemed to help him keep track of time was the number of times he had vomited. He remembered how vigilantly he'd shredded the propaganda provided to him which, as he'd learned, was precisely what his political education officer had wanted him to do, or anything else as equally demonstrative of his anger and frustration over his hideous living conditions as a prisoner of war. They'd done everything to get a phony confession out of him. They'd tried to make him believe he was personally responsible for every last bone on every battlefield, and also how the government back home in the States persisted in its forgetfulness of his predicament. Emotional suffering still reached deep within him. He'd never been able to halt it. He remembered the day he'd been looking on at Sung Buletin Bay from at the forge where he and Wah did their cooking, the crackling charcoal dusty white on top but 1500 degrees Fahrenheit underneath, causing Wah to decide to get her hands on Colonel Ben's service revolver and then turn it over to him. He never would have made it out of the camp and then up this mountain in the clouds without Wah's help. Picturing her holding their clay water jug positioned against her chest, Lansford remembered the ever-present water beetles climbing on its rim and her brushing them onto the dirt floor. He pulled a smile. The padded mud path leading from the forge to this mountain had been damp with dew when he'd escaped. Closing his eyelids, he felt the dew-covered grass against his bare calves, the damp earth still warm from the heat of the previous day. He saw the sun start spilling onto the grass's luminescent tassels, crawling with noisy insects sawing out their monotonous song. A mosquito lit on his cheek. He slapped it dead. Then he heard the chugging noises of the incoming U.S. Navy helicopter returning to search for him. A dreadful stillness came over him. He screwed up his eyelids and saw the chopper's door gunner waving to him. Getting lifted off the ground on the rescue belt lowered to fetch him, he laughed aloud to himself. But then he remembered Colonel Ben coming to their hooch the day prior to his escape. He remembered Ben grabbing hold of Wah's hair from at the back of her head and, in a single slash of his bayonet, slitting her throat from ear to ear. Now, as the Navy helicopter dusted him off to the jungle in the lowlands, everything beyond her slaughter became anticlimactic.